In a different presentation, we briefly discussed the relationship between political philosophy and moral philosophy. In this short presentation, I want to make just a few points that relate political philosophy to the very big topic of human nature. What is human nature? James Madison, the single person most responsible for the U.S. Constitution, put a very good question to us, and here it is. What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If we want a government to succeed, well then a good question to ask beforehand is, well, what are people like? And given human nature, then what is the best possible government? James Madison doesn't believe a perfect world can be created. He doesn't believe a perfect government can be created. But if we have a good sense of what people are like, then we can take that knowledge and try to create the best possible government. Well, this question about human nature is ancient. We see it alluded to here in the ancient Hebrew text of the Psalms, Psalm chapter 8, where the question is posed, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Speaking to God. And then it goes on to place man lower than the angels, but above animals. And so we have some general sense of where this ancient Hebrew writer would place people in relation to angels and other creatures on the planet. But the question isn't specifically answered, and we're not given detailed knowledge. There in the beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Christian Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, we're given a little information about the ancient Hebrew conception of people. That people, on the one hand, are made of the stuff of the earth. I've given you a translation here from the 1300s, the 14th century, from the slime of the earth, this translation says. So that's one element of people. People are made of the same stuff as the natural world, which is true. The biological content of our body is not significantly different from the biological content of other creatures on the planet. So on the one hand, people are, physically speaking, are very much like other creatures on the planet. But the ancient Hebrew conception is that people are something else as well, and that is the stuff of the breath of God. And so it says here that God breathed into the slime of the earth, his breath, God's breath, breathed into that creature the breath of life, and these two things together form the human person, the stuff of the world and the stuff of the spirit. This writer from England, or sort of a mystic from England, from 14th century England, the 1300s, Julian of Norwich, she seems to see something else. She refers to people as having an animal will. And so she sees in people characteristics and traits that she can also see in the very difficult and often violent natural world. But then she says people also possess a godly element, something of the spirit, and so Julian sees this internal struggle. Plato saw something similar. He uses very different language. But Plato, the Greek philosopher, refers to a wild and lawless appetite that resides in every person, even the person who seems the most self-restrained. Still within that person, Plato says, resides lawlessness. Once again, this element of, or this idea that human beings are a mixed creature. There's something wild about us, there's something potentially wonderful about us, and these two elements are struggling. Shakespeare, it seems, sees something similar on the one hand in this passage in his tremendous play Hamlet. He has Hamlet speaking about people, and he says how noble people are, how amazingly smart they are, right? In action, how like angels they can be. They are the beauty of the world. But yet he goes on to say, but what is this quintessence of dust? But on the other hand, you know, really, what is this creature? And then he says, man delights not me. So on the one hand, tremendous capacity for good, for intelligence, for reasonableness. On the other hand, there's something about people that we wince at. There's something about people that we wonder about. How could people be so destructive. We have yet another example from the famous psychoanalyst of the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud. And we can't talk about his theory of the mind at any length, but Freud also sees a struggle taking place in the human person. On the one side, in what he calls the id, there are these animal, brutal, aggressive impulses. On the other side, there's the superego, he says, which is calling us to the highest of ideals, right? This might be the godly will that Julian refers to. And then what Freud calls the ego is stuck in the middle. But the basic idea, Julian, perhaps implied in Genesis, Plato, Freud, Shakespeare, they see people as basically a mixed bag, that people are at war with themselves. There are these aspects of their being that are at war with one another. Perhaps we see the same thing or something similar in St. Paul, Romans chapter 7, where Paul describes a struggle that's taking place within him. There are things he wants to do that he just doesn't do. And then there are things that he doesn't want to do that he does. And he feels himself caught in this struggle, and he's looking for a way out. I think we can see different aspects of human nature in different kinds of societies. And so let's think of the stable societies that we know of. I'll give you the example of Canada. And this is a photograph of a police officer with my son. And the thing to notice is that the police officer has the time to spend time with a tourist from the United States, just sort of playing a game with this young boy from the United States. And we look at the background, and we see order, and we see security, and we recognize that the police are trusted, and the judges are basically trusted, and the military is basically trusted. And in societies like this, people have a sense of freedom. They feel that they can speak their minds. They feel that they can express themselves. They feel that it's possible to bring about change. In these kinds of societies, people basically trust one another. This is an image from a marathon in the Canadian city of Ottawa. And people are helping one another. Some people are providing the runners with beverages, with drinks as they're proceeding on their marathon. People help one another. They basically trust one another. This is a mark of a good society. People don't live in cages. I mean, think about how little separates the people who live in these buildings from folks outside. And if someone outside is committed to getting inside, how relatively easy that would be. And the fact that these folks don't live with cages surrounding their homes indicates a high degree of security and stability, predictability, and order. On the other hand, what are characteristics of societies that are in distress? This is a photo from the city I grew up in California. This is a photo of a restaurant I went to as a child and as a young person. And unfortunately, in the city I grew up in, trust has declined significantly. Crime rates have gone up. Employers have left. Businesses have fled. Consequently, employment has dropped. Investment, economic investment in the community has dropped. People don't trust one another. And this is the result. This is a small apartment complex I lived in as a young child. It was poor then. It's poor now. The difference is that then people were basically poor, but they also basically trusted one another. But I drove past this small apartment complex not long ago and noticed that now there is a great cage in front of the apartment. And this isn't just about setting one property off from another. Obviously, that gate has to do with security and with the sense that the people outside are dangerous. And then we have societies that have failed in some basic respect. And so this heartbreaking photo comes from Syria, where there is an almost complete absence of trust outside my immediate group. We don't trust the police. We don't trust the judges. We don't trust the military. We don't really trust one another. another heartbreaking photo from the civil war in Syria. And this is a very well-known photo from the 1990s of a child in Sudan who was starving to death, and you can see that this presents an opportunity for the vulture in the background. But the point is that there was food available. There were people all around the world who wanted to get food to that child. But the government of the country he lived in was and remains absolutely corrupt and wicked, and it's a society where people cannot trust one another. The simple point is that people who live in stable, secure, and prosperous societies are not biologically different from people who live in chaotic and dangerous societies. Biologically, they're the same. They're not different sorts of creatures, but they do have different sorts of ideas, and ideas have consequences. And so when we think about political philosophy, we need to be realistic about human nature, the facts of human nature, the facts that people who live in stable societies have the capacity to tear their societies down, and people who live in chaotic societies have the capacity to make their societies better. But the important thing for this latter group is that they have to learn the habits that make for stability, and they have to arrive at ideas that will have the kinds of consequences that lead to prosperity, stability, order, and trust. Having a basic sense of human nature is essential when we think about how to organize a society. And this was James Madison's point, that to form a government well, we want to think first about human nature. Well, on that point, I'll say goodbye.